the most evil in any situation. So he would always attempt to bring about the greatest good in any situation and push away the greatest evil in any situation. So it required wisdom, it required sincerity, it required grace, it required intellect, undoubtedly, but it also required a different type of perspective, which is basically, in his view, choosing community over one's individual materialistic gains. So that's why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, a famous prophetic tradition, he said, Ta'is abdul dinar wa abdul dirham. That a person who basically worships materialism, unfortunately, sooner or later, they're going to not find a sense of happiness. Anyone who takes the material gain, right? In our time, we would say money, for example, as the greatest objective of their life, unfortunately, sooner or later, they're going to be disappointed. Right? So this fifth characteristic of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is his nature of choosing the community over his personal materialistic gains, alayhi salatu wassalam. So there's a Quranic verse. Brother Ustad Jawad, is there an echo on my end? Is there an echo in the microphone?
I think there might have been somebody who was unmuted, Sheikh Yusuf.
Okay.
I think you're okay.
Okay. Thank you, Barakallah. So going back to what we were talking about community over individual, right, materialistic gain. So there's an interesting verse in the Quran where Allah, he says about the Prophet Muhammad, and who he is as a person. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا يَسْتَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لَوَّوْا رُؤُوسَهُمْ وَرَأَيْتُهُمْ إِلَى آخِرِ الْآيَةِ مُسْتَكْبِرُونَ. So this Quranic verse, it addresses a type of people. A people who, due to certain reasons, certain materialistic reasons, they didn't want to accept the Prophet Muhammad as an honest messenger of God. And they would say things like, لولا أنزل هذا القرآن على رجل من القريتين عظيم. For example, why not wasn't the Quran sent upon a different person who had عظيم, يعني قريتين عظيم. They had this amazing amount of power that was measured by the material. And in their characteristic, among other characteristics, right, they would arrogantly turn away from the grace and prayers of the Prophet Muhammad. So Allah says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا يَسْتَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لَوَّوْا رُؤُوسَهُمْ وَرَأَيْتُهُمْ مُسْتَكْبِرُونَ. That they turn away from grace of God. That why not go to the Prophet Muhammad, the Quranic verse says, come to the Prophet Muhammad. When it is said to them, go to the Prophet Muhammad, and he will pray to God to forgive you for the many actions you have chosen to do freely. However, they chose to turn away, so they arrogantly turned their heads away out of arrogance, right? And out of that arrogance, they chose to actually create corruption within a community. So the Prophet Muhammad in this verse, as you can see, he's thinking of the greater good and attempting to push away the most evil. So these people that were corrupted and they were spreading corruption, he attempted to reach out to them through grace and mercy and blessings from God and advice, and ask them to come and seek solace and peace with him so that they can both pray to God on their behalf for the forgiveness of their actions. However, their arrogance, it took over. So we always read this Quranic verse in Surah Yasin, right? إِنَّا جَعَلْنَا فِي أَعْنَاقِهِمْ أَغْلَالًا فَهِيَ إِلَى الْأَذْقَانِ فَهُمْ مُقْمَحُونَ. It's an interesting verse. It's very illustrative. That it is as if there is something holding up, right? Holding up their necks. So they carry their necks high. وهم مقمحون. So they carry these necks of theirs very high, and in that description, they used to use these Arabic words for camels that were very arrogant, that they would, when there is a water in front of them, these camels wouldn't drink from it. So they would carry their heads very high. So that Quranic verse, it basically addresses a group of people who, out of arrogance, out of materialism, among other things, they would extend their heads up. They wouldn't be willing and humble enough to accept happiness and guidance, the spiritual happiness that is in guidance. And that, like a camel that is arrogant and doesn't want to drink from the water, they too don't want to drink from this water. And this water is illustrative for spiritual guidance, right? Spiritual guidance, nearness to God Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala and his blessings. So one day a man by the name of Abdullah ibn Umri, he كتب إلى مالك رحمه الله تعالى. He wrote a letter to Imam Malik. And this individual was a muta'abbid. He was a person who really focused on asceticism, right? The denunciation of worldly matter, and focused so much on worship. And the worship that we're talking about here are like prayers, fasting, these type of individual forms of worship. And in that context, charity. He actually wrote a letter to Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. And يحضه على الانفراد, like he's advising him about the benefits of going into seclusion, asceticism, separating yourself from material gain, people, and going on your own worshiping endeavor. So he was advising him of the benefits of doing that. This is Imam Malik, right? So many of us know who Imam Malik is, this great Imam from Al-Madinah who passed away the year 179 in the Hijri calendar, rahimahullah ta'ala. So Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, what's interesting about it is he received the letter and he read the letter and he benefited from the letter. However, Imam Malik was extremely wise and had tremendous wisdom. So he responded to him in another letter. And he said a statement. He said, Inna Allah qasama al-a'mal kama qasama al-arzaq. That the Almighty God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has measured and distributed good deeds, a'mal, good actions, just like how the Almighty has measured and distributed al-arzaq, which is livelihood, materialism. So when we look in society, we look around us, there's the rich, right? There's the mediocre, there's the poor. Righteous deeds are like material gain. That the Almighty, he distributes forms of goodness in piety and its different avenues, like he distributes wealth to people, to different people, right? He says, كُلًّا نُمِدُّ هَؤُلَاءِ وَهَؤُلَاءِ مِنْ عَطَاءِ رَبِّكَ وَمَا كَانَ عَطَاءُ رَبِّكَ مَحْظُورًا انظُرْ كَيْفَ فَضَّلْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. So the Almighty, he says in the Quran that he gives هَؤُلَاءِ مِنْ عَطَاءِ رَبِّكَ, he gives it to everybody, provision, right? Livelihood, to Muslim, to non-Muslim, etc., regardless of their faith, based on his divine decree and measurement, subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But then the Almighty, he also says at the same time, انظر كيف فضلنا بعضهم على بعض. Think about this, ponder over this, how some people, they're born into richness, right? They're born into a family of richness, and they have all this provision, whereas other people, they're working and they're grinding to get through the day. Then he ends these verses with, وَلَلْآخِرَةُ أَكْبَرُ دَرَجَاتِ وَأَكْبَرُ تَفْضِيلًا. The afterlife, however, has greater differences in grace and stature, وَأَكْبَرُ تَفْضِيلًا, and more honored positioning. And that's measured not by the amount of money you have in this life, but the amount of goodness you have done in your life, right? So Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, he responded, as we said, to Abdullah in this letter, and he says to him, Inna Allah qasama al-a'mal kama qasama al-arzaq. That the Almighty, he has distributed provision like he distributes and makes people of different classes, etc., exist within society, so too come righteous actions. Now you might say, how is that so? So he goes on to write in his letter. So he says, for example, فَرُبَّ رَجُلٍ فُتِحَ لَهُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. It's a possibility that the Almighty has opened doors to some people through their many prayers. So we're talking about the 5 daily prayers, right? But also the voluntary prayers. There are people that Allah has made prayers easier for them. And it's part of their nature. And it's in their heart. And they enjoy it. And you see them. They're constantly praying their obligatory prayers first, and then their voluntary prayers. And they're very sincere in this regard. And the Prophet Muhammad, when he was asked, what is the best form of deeds, right? He said, kathrat as-sujud. The more sujud, prostrations you complete, which essentially means prayers, right? That is of the greatest forms of worship to the Almighty. And he went on to say, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, so like we said, رُبَّمَا فَتَحَ لِرَجُلٍ فِي صَلَاتِهِ وَرُبَّمَا فَتَحَ رَجُلًا فِي صَدَقَاتِهِ, that some people, the Almighty has opened doors, right? He has blessed them and pushed them towards, in this provision, charity. So they give out in lots of charity. More so, for example, possibility than the person who has more prayers than them. So these people are giving more in charity, and it's easy for them, and it's a blessing, and they seek the Almighty's grace through that, more so than the prayers they're performing in comparison to the person prior to them. So that person is praying many prayers, but doesn't give out a lot of charity. And the second person is giving out a lot of charity, but prays their 5 daily prayers, and that's it. So he started to give these examples throughout it. And what Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was known for wasn't his worship, in the sense that what we tend to explain worship with, right? We tend to mean like prayer, fasting, etc. Actually, Ibn al-Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that Imam Malik wasn't known for many voluntary prayers and many voluntary fasting. However, Ibn al-Mubarak, he said, and he alluded to, that Imam Malik was known for his provision and time spent in knowledge, education, and teaching people. So then Imam Malik, he said in this letter, after he talked about the different types of worships and different people, then he said, وَنَشْرُ الْعِلْمِ مِنْ أَفْضِلِ أَعْمَالِ الْبِرِّ. He said that teaching, producing, educating people is one of the best forms of righteous actions. وَقَدْ رَضِيتُ بِمَا فَتَحَ اللَّهُ لِي. That's what he said, فَتَحَ اللَّهُ لِي. He said, and I am content with the provisions of God that He has given to me and taught me and allowed for me to do when it comes to teaching people. So I'm grateful and I am content with that provision the Almighty has given to me. وَأَرْجُو أَنْ يَكُونَ كُلُّنَا عَلَى خَيْرٍ وَبِرٍّ. That's how he ended his letter. And I hope that everyone, regardless of the pathway, the provision that they have been given, if it's extra prayers, if it's extra charity, if it's extra fasting, if you're dutiful to your parents more so than other people, etc., whatever that pathway of grace is, Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala said, وَأَرْجُو أَنْ يَكُونَ كُلُّنَا عَلَى خَيْرٍ وَبِرٍّ. That I hope and I pray to God that every one of us, you who's writing the letter, me who's responding, but also the people in between we're describing, are all on righteous path. They're all doing the right thing. So as you can see, the concept of goodness here, but also, which is the context of what we're talking about, is community, right? The greater good, the lesser evil, and how people really within a community, it's not always exactly the same. People, there's a lot of differences in culture, in nature, in personalities, nationalities, languages, philosophies, etc. But there is an underlying factor that brings them together. After humanity, after the brotherhood, like Imam Qurtubi, he said, humankind is like a brotherhood. After that brotherhood. So that's goodness. And Islamic theology, it's faith. for example, that can bring people into good. But that doesn't mean we don't help and وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, we don't support goodness from the graces and good practices of other people's faith. So Muslims are open, just like the Prophet Muhammad used to do, to collaborate with people of different faiths in a common cause of goodness. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he emphasized community, as we have been talking about. And you can see from Imam Malik's statement, and he has many statements, but this one it's a very special one. I always love reading and reflecting over and pondering over the fact that human beings are very diverse in their nature, and even in piety. We tend to think differences are present, are there when it comes to materialism, right? However, differences also exist not only in nature of people and nurture of people, etc. We're talking about righteous actions themselves. So Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, right, 7th century scholar, a tremendous scholar, historian, muhaddith, etc., 7th and 8th century. He wrote a book about al-kaba'ir. The kaba'ir are the major sins in Islam. And he compiled 70, okay? And he argued that this was basically in accordance to certain references from the Islamic texts. Without getting into too much detail about how many there are of major sins, what are their definitions, etc., we're just going to approach it from his writings, okay? So Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, he wrote a book about these major sins, and he wrote that there was 70. And he compiled them and he gave the references, among other things. Let's stop and think about these major sins. So when we think of major sins, right, there's ijma' about qatl al-nafs allati harram Allah, the murder, right? Murder, there's ijma' in murder that it's forbidden, it's a major sin, right? Among other ma'asi, among other sins. However, I don't think a lot of Muslims are aware of some of the major sins that are mentioned and that also exist, that involve interacting with other people. It involves community, and it also involves the concept of the greater good and the lesser evil. So Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, for example, he said, al-kabiratul hadiyati wa thalathun. I'm just going to go through various numbering. He went from 1 to 70. I'm going to bounce around just for the ease of our discussion here. He said, al-qadi su, an evil judge. Now you might say, okay, why is that, right? The fact of the matter is, the individual who holds that position can do a lot of good, but if they're not sincere and they're not good people, they can do a lot of bad, right? And it affects a lot of people in their bad. So the qadi here, though we tend to think of it as a judge, it also means a number of things. A scholar, for example. It could also mean a community leader, okay? Like the Prophet Muhammad, he said, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولَةٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, that everyone is a shepherd and he has a flock or she has a flock they're in charge of, right? A mother to her children, whatever her responsibilities may be, a husband and his responsibilities of a family or livelihood, etc. Every one of us has some level of authority over someone else, even over your own self, because the human body in Islamic theology is considered a gift from God. So you have an intellectual responsibility to care for it. And that's why the Almighty, he said, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا. You're not allowed to kill yourself, right? Suicide in Islam is forbidden. So he says that that is one of the major sins, al-qadi su, an evil, treacherous qadi, judge, a person of authority. He goes on to say, al-kabiratu rabi'atu al-khumsun. He says that the 24th major sin, أذية عباد الله وتطول عليهم. He said harming servants of God, creatures of God. So this is a general statement that has specifics more so, but it is a general statement that this is considered from the major sins. الكبيرة الحادية والخمسون, the 25th major sin. استطالة على الضعيف والمملوك والجارية والزوجة وَالدَّابَّةِ لِأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَمَرَ بِالْإِحْسَانِ إِلَيْهِمْ. This is a very fantastic message on the 25th major sin. الاستطالة على الضعيف والمملوك والجارية والزوجة والدابة لأن الله تعالى قد أمر بالإحسان إليهم. That transgressing bounds on a weak person or a person that's weaker than you. A mamluk, servant. Al-jariya, same thing. Was-zawja. The zawja is your spouse. Transgressing limits against your spouse. Wa-dabba. Dabba is an animal. And it can be a personal animal that you utilize, like a riding animal. It could be a guard dog if you utilize a guard dog, for example. Or it could be a general animal within the vicinity of the confinements, meaning what is natural in the natural situation. Because we know, for example, if we get into the topic of hunting for sport in Islam is forbidden, right? There's a purpose behind that, which is livelihood, which is a different subject. But he says here, وَالدَّابَّةِ. And then he goes on to say, لأن الله تعالى قد أمر بالإحسان إليهم. Because the Almighty God has ordered great interactions, right? Ihsan, highest level of goodness in your manners, in your actions towards these type of categories. What a fantastic statement. What an inclusive statement, right? It is inclusive. It is bringing people within bounds of halal and haram and proper treatment with them. So Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, I'm going to provide one more example of a major sin he had mentioned. Al-Kabiratul Hadiyatu was-Sittun. He said that the next major sin that he is talking about, which is the 61st major sin, he says, Man'u fadl al-ma'. He is saying to scorch, right? To prevent others from benefiting from water, the water you have that you do not require to use, and people or animals are in need of that water, and you are stingy in this regard and you don't give it to them, is considered actually a major sin. Because what's interesting about water, as much as we think we own water, Allah says in the Quran, قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَصْبَحَ مَاؤُكُمْ غَوْرًا فَمَنْ يَأْتِيكُمْ بِمَاءٍ مَعِينٍ. That the Almighty, He وَاللَّهُ أَنزَلَ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً. Right? The Almighty, He mentions in the Quran, وَهُوَ الَّذِي مَرَجَ الْبَحْرَيْنِ هَذَا عَذْبٌ فُرَاتٌ وَهَذَا مِلْحٌ أُجَاجٌ. Almighty, in a number of verses in the Quran, He talks about basically His ownership of the concept of water. That Almighty was the one who descended water upon people, right? Rain, etc. It was through His design, subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the one who, for example, gave pure water for people to utilize, to be able to drink and sustain themselves, versus other forms of water they can't utilize. Oceanic waters, I mean to say, to drink it, for example, to nourish themselves with. And He says, قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَصْبَحَ مَاؤُكُمْ غَوْرًا فَمَنْ يَأْتِيكُم بِمَاءٍ مَعِينٍ. Say if it were to occur that the Almighty basically withholds the water from reaching you, who would be able to provide you with sustainable water? And we know that the amount of water is a very limited amount of percent that human beings can nourish themselves with. And all of the humankind is sharing this minimal amount of available water to live, which is just an amazing thing. It really is. And Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, just on this point, marfu'an, he had narrated a narration, I don't want to say marfu'an, but mursalan, that he received from the people of knowledge in his area, right? Because he learned from the tabi'in, the students of the companions, that one of the signs of the day of judgment is that the water temperatures will increase. They will heat up. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So the Kabiratul Hadi was-Sittun, the 61st major sin is preventing other people from benefiting from water that you are able to give to them when they're in need, and it's extra for you, meaning your honest need has passed, you've nourished yourself and you've utilized what is required of you to exist, etc. Now other people need to exist, they need to nourish themselves, and you prevent other people from utilizing it. And that's why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, لِكُلِّ كَبْدَةٍ رَطْبَةٍ أَجْرٌ. Nourishing, feeding any living creature, there's a reward for it. Okay. So Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, these are all very important parts for us to think about when we talk about community. And we think about the greater good, the lesser evil, and وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ وَمَن يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Right? And the concept of allowing the other over your personal materialistic desires. So when people were in need, the Muhajirun and Ansar, as many of us know this narrative in the Quranic verse, the Ansar were glorified because Muhajirun, who were people that didn't have wealth, didn't have livelihood, etc., the Prophet Muhammad was giving to them wealth to help them live, because now they're in a new area, they don't have sustenance, etc. And the Ansar, the helpers, they have their businesses, they were at home, nothing changed. تَبَوَّأُ الدَّارَ وَالْإِيمَانَ مِنْ قَبْلِ, that this was the first city of faith, right? They were glorified in the Quran because they were patient in allowing those that were in need from the community to benefit from the community's funds, because they too needed to live and they too needed a livelihood, which is essentially, as a side point, one of the main objectives of the new program we have at MET, the We Care program that we will be, inshallah, announcing in the future, God willing. So I'd like to end with a teaching of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, for us to think about something. So Hajj al-Mansur, rahimahullah ta'ala, so the Khalifa, he went and visited Imam Malik. The Khalifa went to do Hajj in Mecca and the surrounding areas. And Imam Malik, he was in Medina. While he was there, because Mansur, the Khalifa, he was from the Iraq region. That's where the Abbasid Khalifas were. Okay, that was their capital. So he went to do Hajj, and at that time, what had happened was he asked his messenger to go get Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala. So he got him and he sat with him and they chatted, and he had many questions to ask Imam Malik, and he was just so surprised at the knowledge of Imam Malik. And he knew that interesting thing, which was, he knew, إِنِّي رَأَيْتُ أَصْلَ الْعِلْمِ رِوَايَةُ أَهْلِ الْمَدِينَةِ. He said, I knew that the basis of knowledge that was available to society at that time, this is the Khalifa saying, I was aware that it was in Medina. It was preserved in Medina, right? Medina, the city of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because it really hadn't been changed since the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The other areas, the Sham, the Syria, surrounding areas, Iraq, etc., it became civilizations, very diverse, multifaceted, varying cultures and language and dialects and wealth, etc. Right? Medina to Salam, this amazing city for the first time, arguably in many aspects of history, was being built. And then in Medina, it was very humble, still very, very humble. The life was still very similar to the life of the companions in many avenues. So al-Mansur, the Khalif al-Mansur, he says to Imam Malik that I am aware that the knowledge was really preserved in Medina in our time. So what I would like from you, and what I would like for it to be done, is I'm going to تنسخ نسخا ثم بعث لكل مصر من المسلمين. I'm going to copy your Al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta, it was Imam Malik's book he compiled containing a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, prophetic teachings, statements of the Prophet Muhammad, prophetic actions of the Prophet Muhammad, he wrote down and preserved, right, through the chain of transmissions many of us are aware of, and the actions of the companions, he wrote it down and preserved it, right, and he authenticated and went through that process, right, and fiqh of Ahlul Madinah, he compiled this amazing work. So the Khalifa, he said, well, I'd like us to make copies of this, and I want it to be utilized in all parts of the Muslim empire. And at that time, Islamic civilization had really, really spread through the lands tremendously. And he was aware that there was a lot of philosophy being involved in argumentations, and differences of opinion were arising on certain points when it comes to not the foundations, but outside of the foundations. And Imam Malik, he heard that from him. And he said a statement. He said to the Khalifa when he asked him to do those things, he said, لا تفعل. He said, don't do that. And the reason is, كل قوم بما سيق إليهم وعملوا بها. He said that every people, what had reached them of knowledge and wisdom, and because the companions, they spread through the lands, and their students were living in very different parts of the world, and they taught from the knowledge that they had and had learned from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Like Aisha, for example, I'm just using this as an example. She was intimate with the Prophet Muhammad, so she taught aspects of his life and teachings that were related to interactions of the husband and wife, among other things, like prayer, because she would see his prayer and his actions, so she knew that personal life of his, and she taught those intimate aspects of his sunnah. Abdullah bin Umar would see the Prophet Muhammad, this young man, outside in a different course, so he learned aspects of it, the Prophet's life, from the outside. And Umar al-Khattab, he used to say, he would exchange with his companion friend, they would become companions, and one day he would go learn from the Prophet, then he would go the next day and seek his livelihood, while the other companion would go and learn from the Prophet Muhammad. Then they would come back and meet each other, and they would teach each other what they learned on the days they missed. So the point I'm trying to say is like the Prophet Muhammad, he said a very powerful statement. He said, نَضَّرَ اللَّهُ امْرِئًا سَمِعَ مَقَالَتِي فَوَعَاهَا فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَهَا. The Almighty, he gives bless, nur, light, spiritual enlightenment, etc., to a person who learns my teachings, hears it, contemplates it, and then teaches it to other people. Right? And Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, or Amr ibn As, for example, he used to write the prophetic traditions down. He would write it down at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And Abu Huraira eventually started to write them down as well, etc. A number of companions, they used to write it down, and others would memorize it, etc. So the point is that Imam Malik, he said these companions with these wisdoms and knowledge, they went to these different parts of the world, or they carried their experiences and perspective on things. And he said, مَخْتَارَ كُلِّ بَلَدٍ لِأَنفُسِهِمْ. And the people and the cultures, they chose what was good for their community, as long as it was in consistence with the Islamic teachings, which is it is a deen of samhat, right? In the Ibrahim ibn Hanif is samhat. The Prophet Muhammad, he said, I was sent with a religion that is samhat, is forgiving, and it is forbearing, etc. in its nature. So then Imam Malik, he goes on to say, وَإِنْ رَدَّهُمْ عَمَّا اعْتَقَدُوهُ شَدِيدٌ. He said, if you are to alter people in a way for which they have now learned to believe and grasp onto and became part of their practice, and it was acceptable, if you try to change something that's acceptable and good, it could cause a greater evil in the community, because what will happen is, because they're going to reject these things, and it can be a means of discourse between the community, right? It could be a means of discourse between the community, because, for example, on many things, there are ways we can do them on multiple fronts, meaning you can approach it in a way that is collectively acceptable from a different route. So if I know my home is located somewhere, and I geographically study that I can reach this home using several different routes, this is the perspective of the companions when it came to that matter, right? As long as it was acceptable. It's a possibility at times you believe that a certain route is the fastest and best, and that's your prerogative, but we also know that there are other routes that can reach that destination that are acceptable, as long as it's acceptable, right? So you can see from Imam Malik's wisdom, he was trying to find the greater good and prevent the greater evil, right? The greater good with the lesser evil, and prevent the greater evil when it comes to matter. So I'll end on one example. As a parent, if your son, child, etc., does something wrong, and you want to discipline this child of yours, is the discipline that you're doing greater than the actual action your son or daughter did? Because your discipline could be worse than the actual action that they did. So you actually have brought a greater evil in comparison to a lesser evil in theory. And I think as parents, we make this mistake quite a bit. And this is the essence of fiqh. This was the madhab of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So if a child does something wrong, as a parent, if I want to discipline them, is the discipline that I am doing, the choice I have made in the means of disciplining this child, a greater evil or not? And this happens a lot. It happens quite a bit. And as parents, we think we're doing the right thing, but actually we've done wrong in this regard. Right? We've done wrong in this regard. Ar-Rahimuna yarhamuhum ar-Rahman. Those that show mercy, the merciful will be merciful to them, which is God will be merciful to them. Allahu A'lam, brothers and sisters. We'll stop here. The Almighty knows best. Subhanallah bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. We can open the floor for questions if anyone is interested. I understand that we have different ways of doing that. We can type in messages through Zoom, or you can text message the speaker, among other things as well. Allah
Thank you. Thank you, Sheikh Yusuf. Yes, please put in your questions in the chat. We can get to them, or also if there were other questions for you, Sheikh Yusuf, we can go over those. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there are some questions here we'll talk about. So a question about the qira'at, the different methods of recitation of the Quran. So in short, these were methods of recitation of the Quran that have an acceptable transmission to the Prophet Muhammad. So it's preserved. So that's why sometimes you hear in some regions in the world, Maliki Yawmiddin versus Maliki Yawmiddin. These are acceptable recitations, and both are attributed to the source itself. Similarly, among other things, يسألونك عن المحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن. But another recitation is يطهرن. Right? So these are acceptable recitations. They are mutawatir in their essence. They are attributed back to the acceptable recitations of the Quranic text, taught by the companions whom they themselves learned from the Prophet Muhammad. Like, for example, Hafs an Asim. Asim, he learned from Abdullah bin Mas'ud and Ali radiallahu ta'ala. So those are great reciters of the Quran from the companions of the Prophet Muhammad who learned it from the Prophet Muhammad. And there are a number of examples like that. Like Ibn Amir, he learned it from Uthman ibn Affan. And actually, there's an example for us to be aware of. Imam Malik once was asked a question. He said the people in Sham, which is Syria, greater Syria area, they pronunciate Abraham as Ibrahim. That's how they pronunciate it. And when they recite Quran, they utilize that pronunciation. So then Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, who learned the recitation from Nafi', who learned it from the companions, he said, we have the Mus'haf of Uthman with us. Bring the Mus'haf to us. So they brought the Mus'haf and they opened it, and it was as they recited it. So both recitations were acceptable, and the meanings were consistent with one another, because the Almighty, He had made the Quran, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. The Almighty has made avenues for the remembrance and preservation, recitation of the Quran easier on the tongues of people. So this is actually a very beautiful thing. And through learning these, learning and being aware of these acceptable recitations and that are mutawatir, that have been narrated and established and accepted and proven of their honesty, you learn to be open-hearted. You learn to understand how things can be approached, but the purpose and objective are same, though maybe it appears that there is a variance, a difference between these two different perspectives on a matter. But actually it opens your heart. It opens your heart, and you become, it helps with, it is a form of increasing your knowledge of the Quran and drawing closer to Allah, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The best of you are those who study the Quran and teach it to others. And Umar al-Khattab, he said, إن الله سيرفع قوما بهذا الكتاب ويضع بها آخرين, that the Almighty will elevate the status of people through this Quran, this revelation, and lower the status of others through this Quran and revelation. I hope to have addressed the question. Jazakallah khair. Difference between Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa. So they actually lived at the same time. They crossed paths. I mean, in the eras that they lived. Imam Abu Hanifa, he passed away the year 150 Hijri calendar. Imam Malik, he passed away 179 of the Hijri calendar. So Imam Malik lived 29 years after Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam Abu Hanifa was in the Iraq region, whereas Imam Malik was in Medina, in the Hijazi region. And they were both phenomenal scholars, and they respected and appreciated one another, and appreciated the knowledge of each that were brought forth. So in short, each one taught what they knew of the knowledge that had reached them. Like Imam Abu Hanifa, many of his teachings come from the route of Abdullah bin Mas'ud and Ali radiallahu ta'ala, because they went to that region and they lived there and they were scholars of the companions. Many of the knowledge that Imam Malik knew were from Abdullah bin Umar, for example, and others who were in the region of Al-Hijaz. So each one taught in accordance to the knowledge that they received, and each one said a common statement. They said, every human being, you accept things from them and you reject some things from them, except illa sahib hadha al-qabr, Imam Malik, he said, for example, except for one person, which is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they both agreed on this aspect, and they were both attempting to draw closer to God through the knowledge that they were aware of, and help to guide people in attempt to please the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. I hope to have addressed the question. Okay, brothers and sisters, there are no other questions here, and now I pray that the Almighty accepts from us and forgives our faults and laxes. This is the end of this particular series. I hope this was uplifting and beneficial to you all, and any mistakes that were made, they're from my own part, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us all in this regard. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Yusuf. May Allah bless you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Inshallah.